past as in part alignment with the glorious tradition of the past, but also alignment with the divine vision of the future.
And that's where we're seeing Moses, right? It goes to the 70 below Moses, right? So all the connections, right? Honesty about the past, right? A clear eye towards what should be hindsight, a clear vision of the reality of the obstacles ahead. You're not going to overinflate them. You're not going to underestimate them. And also the relationship up, which is direct to Moses. They're starting to disintegrate.
Yeah, it's not arbitrary. Jordan, one of your lines is, truth is the antidote to suffering, if I'm not mistaken. But that is true. This is not just, we'll tell yourself a different story or something. No, this is true and this is false. And so the renewing of the mind in relation to the higher principle for which you are made, and which is you might say, the actual nature of things, is, you might say, the antidote to our own self-delusion.
A word on Caleb. Caleb is another non-Hebrew stock hero in the Torah. It's Kalev ben Yefuneh HaKnizi, Caleb the son of Yefuneh, or Jefuneh the Kenizzite. The Torah goes out of its way to tell you this is not a Hebrew.
Oh, so it's another noble outsider.
So you have the daughter of Pharaoh, you have Noah, you have Jethro, and you have Caleb, one of the only two spies to say we can conquer Canaan. The non-Jewish stock hero.
So he's like the grateful immigrant.
Yeah. And absolutely, of which we need more. But I just again want to note, the Jews come out pretty poorly in the Torah. The non-Jews come out quite well.
Yeah, I want to just point out just one last, little thing, just for people who love the beautiful structure of how the text lays itself out. One of the possible readings of the name Caleb is dog. And so you have Joshua and the dog, the Kenizzite, who take over Canaan. And then Caleb gets the edge of the camp. He gets the periphery of the camp. He's not a Israelite. And so, flash forward to Christ. There's a little wordplay and game happening with Christ when he encounters the Canaanite woman who comes to him and asks Christ, and Christ says, do not give to the dogs that which goes to the children. And then he ultimately says, I have not seen such faith. As in her.
Yeah, because she says the dogs can eat, the dogs can eat the crumbs.
The crumbs which fall off the edge of the table. She's referring directly to this story, I think, to Caleb, who gets the edge and who is one of the people that came in with faith into the land. So all these subtle references in the New Testament.
And these are the two who produce the positive report. And so it's this unity of the center and the fringe as well that are represented. It's worth thinking about. Oz.
If you read the whole story first, at least for me, you think the golden calf is far worse. It's the big rebellion. But clearly this one is actually just as bad for the Jews. Is that not right? Because the punishment, only 3,000 die after the golden calf. An entire adult generation dies off before they can go on. Presumably because they're skeptical about the promised land. The Lord had promised it, and they doubted it.
Well, we have that problem in our culture right now because everybody's so dubious about the future, right? We don't have a uniting vision of the future. And to the degree that there is a uniting vision, it's really a vision of timidity in relationship to the impending apocalypse.
But there's something of Noah, by the way, in this, what's going on, right? The whole generation has to pass, and Noah with his animals cross over the water into the promised land. And I think that's also part of Joshua and Caleb.
Purifying of the people.
Oh, yeah.
Forgive me for one last interjection, but you raised this question of Nietzsche. And there's actually a great anti-Semite in 19th century culture, and an anti-Semite in an intellectual sense. I don't mean, and I don't know this, but well, no, one of Wagner's mentors in the sense of Schopenhauer. So Schopenhauer attacks the Semitic religions, what he thinks of as the Semitic religions, and he thinks of Judaism and Islam. And he says these are idiotic religions because they're life-affirming. And he's been deeply influenced by what he takes to be Indian religion. I mean, it's rather an imperfect knowledge that he has given the period, but it's a sort of form of Buddhism, right? So he thinks the antidote to suffering is resignation, and the great mistake of both Judaism and Islam is thinking that the world is a good place because it has been created by a good God. Now, interestingly, Schopenhauer thinks that Christianity is a halfway house. He says he thinks there's an element of this bad Hebraic tradition in Christianity, but Christianity, fortunately, was influenced by something more Indian, a renunciatory tradition, monasticism and that sort of side. Now, in a way, Nietzsche's emphasis upon life affirmation is a critique of Schopenhauer.
Right.
And I think one of the questions I think that's interesting to think of here is what is the nature of this life-affirming dimension to the book of Exodus?
This will come back
and to Jewish thinking in general, with
Exactly.
this emphasis on life more abundant. It's a very pro-human ethos.
Choose life.
We'll see this soon, won't we, in Deuteronomy?
Yes, okay, so fringes, Numbers 15. This is an indication of how these narrative tropes play out in something more concrete. And the Lord, this is 15:37, and the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and bid them that they make fringes in the borders of their garments throughout their generations, and that they put upon the fringe of the borders a riband of blue, and it shall be unto you for a fringe, that ye may look upon it, and remember all the commandments of the Lord, and do them, and that ye seek not after your own heart and your own eyes, after which you used to go a-warring. So that ye may remember and do all my commandments, and be holy unto your God. I am the Lord your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt, to be your God. I am the Lord your God. And so, Jonathan, you want to make a closing comment for now on the idea of fringes? Yeah.
No, I think that it's very important. I think that the notion of fringes is probably one of the categories of existence that we should understand today. Because in some ways we are obsessed with it, but we don't completely understand what the function of the fringe is. And if we did, I think we could help to heal some of the issues that are happening. We tend to go into extremes like the chaos and order, and the fringe is actually space on the edge of the world for things to be left vague, right? It's that space on the edge of perception that we kind of accept that things are...
It's not clear there.
Exactly. So it's the monsters hidden in the border. You see that, like we've talked about before, on the outside of churches, gargoyles, medieval manuscripts. They would have all kinds of irony and monsters and mixtures in the borders of the manuscript. So you'd actually have like the text of the gospel, and then in the border you'd have rabbits fighting knights and snails, all this kind of humor and chaos on the edge.
A carnival. On
and so there's also the corners of the field that should not be tilled is part of that. For the stranger, leaving room for the stranger in your land as well, not kind of cutting off your ethnic group completely. And there's a tradition, and I don't know, Dennis, if you know about this, but there's a tradition that the fringe, doesn't say this in the text, but that the fringe ultimately actually comes to be made for some groups in modern Judaism, or let's say medieval Judaism, out of linen and wool together. And so
that's only the priest.
Only the priest. And so the mixture that is forbidden in the text.
That's right. It's forbidden. Yes.
It's allowed on the fringe.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, well, this is I think this is so interesting psychologically, because one of the problems of perception technically is, well, one concept has to be bordered by another. This is a problem that Derrida really tried to go after, because he was very concerned with the fringe. He thought the fringe should be brought to the center. That's why he thought that the Western phallogocentrism should be upended and reversed. He wanted to bring the margin and the fringe to the center.
He understood how the fringe has a parasitic element if you're not careful, because ambiguity can devour categories if you let it rampant. And so the idea of keeping it on the fringe is to understand that there is ambiguity, but it has to be at the bottom of the mountain, you could say. Whereas Derrida, using oppositional thinking, if you think of, it's like black and white. And then you say, wait a minute, what's this gray? And then everybody starts to lose their mind because they thought everything was just black and white. So he used that in a way to expand the category of strangeness and the category of ambiguity to devour parasitically the categories.
Well, he kind of thought, as far as I could tell, that the fact that there were monsters on the fringe meant that the category system was dangerously incomplete and also oppressive and patriarchal. So I don't think Derrida understood that dichotomy, the gradations between unity and fringe had to be maintained, and that wasn't, the fact that there was a united center and a fringe wasn't merely a consequence of the overlay of a tyrannical patriarchal structure, but a necessity for perception and hierarchical order itself.
How do you understand that in terms of freedom and liberty? I mean, Tsar Alexander was described as the Tsar with a telegraph. But although he was autocratic, the Russian Empire was so big that what the little peasant did out on the frontiers, it didn't matter.
Right.
Xi Jinping is described as the same Tsar with a computer.
Right.
Now, as today, you can drive to the edges with reason, technological surveillance.
Part of the reason that cash is so valuable as a social phenomenon is that you can't keep track of it. Right? Absolutely. It allows fringe enterprises, and you say, well, that'll facilitate criminality. People make the same comment about Bitcoin, but it's like, well, yeah, if you get rid of all the criminals, you probably get rid of all the freedom too. So there has to be this necessity for things. It's like the cleft of the rock, that in some ways the fringe has to be able to hide from the all-seeing gaze of the uniting principle, or there's no possibility for freedom. Greg?
Well, for me, what's so interesting is, we think about conservatism and liberalism through the strain of Big Five, right? Degree of openness is a heavy correlation. High openness tends to be liberal. It's a somewhat fixed trait. So we know to some extent, whether you view that as evolutionarily determined or God-given, we have a necessity to see things both ways, right? We need walls protecting insider groups from outsider groups. If they're too rigid and unporous, new ideas and people won't get in and will perish and die. I'm reading this now, being somebody who comes from a secular tradition, right, and in transit as we all are in terms of figuring out differing meaning. It's so illuminating for me how many times a text which one would identify as inherently conservative makes room for all of this, makes room for the Ethiopian wife, makes room for Caleb, is how I'm accustomed to pronouncing the name. And that the Pharaoh's rigidity, right, and his inability to allow, right, when the slaves are asking for something, it's like, make them gather their own straw now. That if you resist, if you grow angry in the face of it, if you harden against those things, you're turned lily white as a joke, right? And there's a real dialogue in here about the necessity for both of those things when it comes to...
Well, your observation is interesting too, because you could say, extending this argument, that the political dialogue in the West, when it's conducted properly, is something like the dialogue between those who stand for the unity of the center and those who stand for the necessity of the fringe, and that always has to be negotiated, because as things transform across time, which they have to inevitably, the relationship between the united center and the fringe has to be somewhat dynamic. And I think the only way we maintain that, well, this is why free speech is so important, is the only way we can retain that dynamic unity is by engaging in a conversation between those who stand for the fringe and those who stand for the center.
It's driving a car, right? And so liberalism, proper liberalism, is the gas. Like, we got to get somewhere new, and conservatism is the brake. And if you have one, you stand on it and you go nowhere, and everyone's stubborn and crosses their arms, and the other goes flying off cliffs or into brick walls. And so there's a careful negotiation that's a necessity between both perspectives, and it's been captivating for me, because Pajot is been the expert of the fringe on this, right? In the discussion of the monsters and the different kinds of monsters. A monster of too muchness, that's a conservative monster. A monster of too much hybridization is a liberal monster, and it's like you don't want either of those. Both of those things lead to ill.
Well, this is kind of connected to Greg's point. I don't want to go against Pajot's expertise on the fringes as kind of symbolic of chaos, but it's striking that the color is blue. And blue is typically the sort of symbolic of God, of heaven, faith,
loyalty.
Royalty, of course. Royalty,
that's
absolutely.
what the blue is about. Every Jew is a member of the kingdom of priests.
Absolutely. So I wonder if there's another dimension here
It's because there are two fringes, by the way.
Right.
There's a crown.
Yeah.
A crown is also a fringe.
Yeah.
The king is also exceptional the other way.
Right.
And that's something I didn't want to bring into the conversation. It's difficult to understand. The king is not, how could I say, your king is not British.
Yeah.
Right. Your king
the king is not a citizen. The king is not a subject. The
stands
king
above.
transcends.
So the crown is actually a type of fringe,
Yeah.
but it's a fringe moving up, and there's a fringe moving down.
Yeah, Charles III doesn't have a passport. Yeah. No, so I mean, what
artists are like that, by the way.
What it would say, the king can't commit crimes and etc. But so it seems as if the fringes, we can understand the fringes as somehow having a kind of constitutive power. I think it was Chesterton who said that to love anything is to love its limits. And the limits are what creates something. You understand its contours. You understand what it is. You can define it. You can delineate it. And so this is I think there's clearly a symbolism here going on, just as they're on the point of, as it were, reaching the promised land, understanding what this little geographic slice of land is going to be, that they need to understand the importance of the fringes. They need to understand what are the limits that make the land.
It also seems to me that there's a relationship between the conceptualization of the inevitability and necessity of the fringe and the possibility of rationalizing mercy. It's like, well, if you know that, you need the unity because, we're lost in the desert and aimless without the unity. But the fringe is inevitable. And then you see, the fringe is the necessary mediator between categories. You can maintain your allegiance to the unity without becoming dangerously judgmental about the fact that it isn't just the fringe people who don't fit, because it's also the fringes within us, which is, I suppose, also what the clothing represents. Is like you're going to deviate from the divine path continually, and if you were only a worshiper of the unity, let's say, in the perception, you just judge yourself out of existence constantly. So you have to allow for this, like you do with children. You have to allow for this ambiguity around the edges in order to not be a tyrant, even to yourself.
You can also see it as idiosyncrasy. So it's not just ambiguity. It's like we all have our own idiosyncrasy, let's say, but when we come and sit at the family table, we don't bring our idiosyncrasies to the table. Just as we gather together in a common space to worship or to do something, we tend to bring that which can be bound together with others. It doesn't mean that our idiosyncrasies and our little habits and our little things don't exist. It's just that they remain on the fringe at every level of reality.
So that's part of this process of proper subduing, to keep the fringe, to not oppress the fringe out of existence, but to keep it in its proper place in relationship to Mount Sinai.
It's worth noting that for Jews, this is literal. And you will see Orthodox Jews who do wear these fringes, strings, white strings that are hanging. The blue, as you pointed out, James, the blue represents royalty, and it was gotten from a very rare type of snail, which has now been refound, as it were, and now Jews are resuming having techelet, this purple or blue. It's a royal blue. So I just want that people understand this was taken as what the Torah says. You will look on these fringes and remember to do my commandments. It's an ethical string around the finger. A great story from the Talmud. The Talmud has everything in it.
And do you suppose it's as well, is part of this text also the notion that you can look upon the fringes and you can appreciate the fact that they're there, but that shouldn't stop you from orienting yourself towards the central unity in the most fundamental analysis?
Not just stop you, it should push you there.
Right, should remind you?
Yes, remind you. It's what it says, and you will remember. That's the verb. So here's a great story that illustrates the power of tzitzit, for the fringes. And it's amazing that it's even in the Talmud, because you would think of it as rather turgid or very scholarly and pious. So it has to do with a young man who was a Torah student, and apparently he went one day to another town to visit a prostitute. And as he was in front of her, he began undressing. And the Talmud says, as he got to his fringes, the tzitzit, they flew up and smacked him in the face. At that point, he remembered why he is wearing the fringes, and he put his clothing back on. And the prostitute said to him, "Do I not find favor in thine eyes?" It was a very cultivated prostitute. and he said, "No, you do very much, but I am reminded by the fringes how I should act." She was so impressed